Today I'm going to be finishing up my discussion of Andrew Jackson's presidency, focusing on some political and economic issues that will lead eventually to the rise of the Whig Party, which will form generally in opposition to Andrew Jackson. One of these political issues of Jackson's presidency centers around a renewed debate over the Bank of the United States. Now, we've mentioned the bank on numerous occasions and the on-again, off-again controversy surrounding the bank, particularly its its legitimacy or its constitutionality. And we thought that was settled with McCulloch versus Maryland, in which the Supreme Court ruled that the bank was legitimate and that states could not tax the bank and so forth. But some events will happen during Jackson's re-election in 1832, which will renew this debate over the bank and lead to some major economic problems. Just to kind of refresh our memories, the Bank of the United States, one of its primary functions is to help stabilize the U.S. economy, and it does so by exerting influence, controlling influence over a lot of the state and local banks, which are otherwise unregulated. And these unregulated state and private banks, especially with regard to their lending practices, tend to be somewhat irresponsible and reckless in terms of how they loan money. They deal a lot with paper banknotes rather than gold or silver coin, which is what the Bank of the United States deals with. So the presence of the Bank of the United States, the bank won't do business with local banks except with gold coin. So by doing business with these banks in a regulated manner, it forces these state and local banks to kind of do the same thing that the Bank of the United States is doing if they want to do business with the Bank of the United States. So the presence of the bank helps to stabilize the lending practices of these smaller banks, and in doing so, it kind of stabilizes the U.S. economy. Nicholas Biddle was the president of the U.S. Bank, which had, this is, of course, we're talking about the second Bank of the United States, which had been chartered in 1816. Biddle took over as president in 1823. So by the time we get to 1832, Biddle has been the president of the bank for quite a few years, and under his leadership, the bank has become very profitable. The funds of the United States Treasury have been earning interest, and basically for several years now, the economy has enjoyed a period of stability, largely due to the efforts of this Bank of the United States, and of course under the leadership of Nicholas Biddle. Now, despite the success of the bank and the stability that it created, a lot of people were still opposed to the bank. They looked back at the Panic of 1819 and that economic crisis which ensued over wild land speculation, and people still tended to blame banks for that issue, and to a large extent, the local banks, the private and state banks, were big contributors to that economic crisis. The Bank of the United States didn't really have much to do with it. But since it was the biggest bank in the country, people tended to use it as a symbol for their opposition to banks. Even Andrew Jackson was a long-time opponent of banks in general, and specifically the Bank of the United States. So during his first term in office, Andrew Jackson made it clear that he was opposed to the bank. He didn't like the bank. Jackson himself had lost a lot of money during that Panic of 1819. As a plantation owner, he lost money on some investments as well. But and for just like many people, Jackson tended to see the bank as a symbol of the control that the wealthy elite had over the U.S. economy, and he didn't like that. It came to symbolize a lot of the things that he hated about the wealthy elites and their money and their power. And Jackson, as a so-called man of the people, he took a position in opposition to this bank. So despite the economic success of the bank, a lot of people tend to blame it for previous problems. Now, what will end up happening is that in 1832, we're having a presidential election in 1832, the bank is going to become a campaign issue. Now, this is a lot due to the scheming and planning of Henry Clay. Henry Clay, of course, a longtime supporter of the bank. Henry Clay and so a lot of the former Federalists, or these national Republicans, as they're calling themselves now, they are big supporters of the bank and internal improvements, economic stability, and of course strong federal government and those sort of things. Henry Clay is going to run against Andrew Jackson in 1832. And Henry Clay is hoping to use the bank as a campaign issue. Now, the bank's charter is not due to be renewed until 1836. But what Henry Clay does, and some of the national Republicans, they approach Nicholas Biddle, who's the president of the bank, and they ask him to submit his request to recharter the bank to Congress now in 1832 instead of waiting until 1836, because Clay wants to use this as a campaign issue. Clay is hoping that if Congress recharters the bank now instead of waiting until 1836, then President Andrew Jackson will be forced to address this issue now during this election of 1832. And Clay knows that Jackson is an opponent of the bank and that he will most likely veto this rechartering bill, which will make Jackson look foolish in the eyes of the American people. Again, a lot of this is based on an assumption that Clay is making. Clay views the bank as important, and it is important. It has created a lot of economic stability for the nation during this time. But Clay underestimated the opposition to the bank. A lot of people in America, especially in the South and on the western states, tend to look at the bank with a lot of suspicion. And of course, they love Andrew Jackson because of his opposition to the bank and wealthy elites. So Clay has misjudged this situation. Clay is hoping to make Andrew Jackson look foolish when he vetoes this bank charter, and then be able to point to Jackson and say, see, he's opposed to economic stability, he's opposed to economic prosperity, he's going to ruin our economy. And Clay is hoping that this will be people's impression of Andrew Jackson, and this will help Clay win the election of 1832. So the plan is implemented. When Clay and other national Republicans approach Nicholas Biddle and have him submit this charter, or this request to recharter the bank, he does so. Congress approves that rechartering of the bank, and then of course Andrew Jackson will veto that, just like Clay had predicted. But what Clay did not anticipate is how much people would support Andrew Jackson for having done this. Jackson declared the bank as unconstitutional. Of course, he's completely ignoring that Supreme Court ruling in McCulloch versus Maryland, which said that the bank was constitutional, the bank was legitimate. Jackson says that he will decide for himself what is or isn't constitutional, and he's not going to really pay much attention to the Supreme Court. So here again, Jackson is openly defying the Supreme Court in his opposition to the bank. So what happens is that in vetoing this bank, Jackson will actually win more support from the people, especially his base supporters, the small town America, the common people, the average man on the street, that sort of thing. They tend to celebrate Jackson for his vetoing of this bank. And Jackson will defeat Clay in 1832 very easily because of this. So here again, Clay grossly misinterpreted how people would respond to Jackson's vetoing of the bank, and it completely backfired on him. So Jackson will win re-election in 1832, and when he does, he will consider this re-election as a mandate to get rid of the bank. Since he voted again, he vetoed the bank's recharter, and people loved him for it. They re-elected him. He's going to consider this a mandate to get rid of the bank, and that's exactly what he does. So one of the first things he does after being reelected is he vows to destroy the bank. So the way of course, he's not going to tear the bank down literally. Basically, he will deplete the bank of its funds, and then without the money, without the funds and those deposits in the Bank of the United States, it becomes essentially just an empty building and has no real power anymore. So what Jackson does, he orders the Secretary of Treasury to remove all of the federal government's money from the Bank of the United States and deposit it into state and private banks. Now, as it turns out, most of these state and private banks that Jackson has ordered our money to be deposited into are owned by friends of Andrew Jackson. They called them pet banks. Critics of Andrew Jackson referred to these state and local banks as Jackson's pet banks because most of them were owned by his friends and his political allies. Well, the Secretary of Treasury will resign in protest over this. According to federal law, the United States government's money is supposed to be deposited in the Bank of the United States. That was all part of the original deal. Even though Jackson vetoed the recharter of the bank, the bank's current charter is still in effect. So technically, the bank is still in operation until 1836, when its current charter expires. So Jackson's order to withdraw federal funds from this bank is a violation of current federal law. Especially when you look at the fact that all these state and local banks that he's talking about are owned by his friends. This looks very corrupt and very unethical. And this is why the Secretary of Treasury resigns in protest. He doesn't want to be part of this. So Jackson appoints a new Secretary of Treasury, a guy named Roger B. Taney. Roger B. Taney is a close friend of Andrew Jackson, a close friend and political ally. Taney is also the owner of one of these state banks. So here again we see another example of how, despite Jackson's claims of being opposed to corruption and political favors, he is doing the same thing that he said he would never do. Using unethical behaviors, violating federal laws, promoting friends who will directly benefit from this order. So this new Secretary of Treasury, Roger B. Taney, he complies with Jackson's order. He removes all the United States money from the Bank of the United States and deposits it in the state and private banks. And later on, Jackson will appoint Taney as a Supreme Court justice, as kind of a payback for Taney's cooperation in this bank ordeal. So Jackson here is going against federal law by removing the federal government's money from the Bank of the United States. He's also behaving unethically in that he's distributing this money to banks that are owned by his friends and his political allies. And this is the exact opposite of what Jackson has proclaimed all along. He said he was an opponent of the wealthy elites. He was an opponent of banks, and he championed the cause of the common man. But everything that he's doing here is pretty much just the opposite of that. These banks owned by Jackson's friends, these guys are wealthy elites. These are the very people that Jackson has claimed that he hates. He doesn't support them, and he supports all these common people. Basically, what he's doing here is he's basically going back on his word. So this is just kind of an example of how much people are opposed to this bank. When he does this, no one other than the National Republicans, no one really criticizes him. Jackson's supporters all celebrate the fact that he's destroying the bank. Finally, we're getting rid of this bank, this evil symbol of economic oppression, and everyone loves him for it. But they're not all able to see the big picture here. What ends up happening as a result of this, of course, here's our Bank of the United States. Again, without the deposits of the federal government's money, the bank becomes essentially an empty building, and it serves no purpose. Even though the bank's charter doesn't expire until 1836, without the money in the bank, it becomes effectively impotent. It has no power, no influence, and when its charter expires in 36, it'll just simply cease to exist. What happens as a result, though, is without this Bank of the United States, this to create a stable lending environment, a stable economy, these local, private, and state banks are pretty much free to do whatever they want to do now. There's no oversight here. And while there were no regulations before, the presence of the bank kind of helped to keep these smaller banks in check. Without the U.S. bank, these state and local banks are free to kind of do whatever they want to. Keep in mind, there are no banking regulations during this time in history. So if you own a bank, you can pretty much do whatever you want to with that money. So these small banks start loaning out all this money, the federal government's money, in easy credit terms, and this leads to a spike in land speculation. And we talked about land speculation before, back in the Panic of 1819. Easy credit terms means that people can borrow a bunch of money with easy terms, and then they can go buy a bunch of land out on the frontier and then sell that land off in little pieces and make a profit. And this is just the whole idea behind land speculation, is that you're buying up large chunks of land and then you're going to sell it off in little pieces, and eventually you'll make a profit. You'll pay off your loan that you borrowed, pay off the money that you borrowed to buy the land with your profits, and you'll be rich. And it's on the surface it seems very easy and very simple, and it's one of the reasons why a lot of people will flock to this idea of land speculation, and it creates problems because a lot of these banks are now they're issuing paper notes without the gold in their vaults to back it up, and this basically creates a hollow economy. There's nothing of any real value here changing hands. A lot of people will mortgage their farms and their homes in order to buy land, and this land that they're buying is on the frontier. If you remember way back in the beginning, we talked about the federal government selling land on the frontier as a way of generating revenue. Remember the land ordinance of 1785? That's still in effect, and this land that people are buying, this land speculation, people are buying up public land or federal lands, buying land from the federal government at a very low price, and then sitting on it for a little while, and then selling it at a profit in smaller pieces. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about this land speculation. This is the land that they're buying up. They're buying up land from the federal government. Well, Andrew Jackson, despite his hatred of the banks and the wealthy elites, he's not stupid. He sees what's happening here with this land speculation and this rapid expansion of this real estate and land market. He sees that this is probably not a good thing for the economy, this sudden and rapid expansion. So he figures it's a good idea to try and rein this in, try to slow this down a little bit. So Jackson issues an executive order called the Specie Circular. The term specie refers to hard precious metals, gold and silver coins, so hard currency. So Specie Circular, this executive order says that public lands, basically land sold by the federal government, can only be purchased with gold or silver. So you cannot purchase federal lands or cannot purchase land from the government using paper banknotes. You have to purchase this land with gold or silver coins only. Well, the problem is that a lot of these banks aren't issuing loans of gold or silver. They're issuing loans of paper banknotes. So what happens is that when people, okay, I've mortgaged my farm, I've got this big bag full of paper banknotes, I'm going to go buy some land from the government. The government won't accept paper banknotes anymore. So I go back to the bank and I want gold instead of paper money. The bank says they don't have any gold, because that's all they have is paper money. So then this creates a panic now. The land market collapses since the public land can only be purchased with gold or silver. There's not as much demand for it because people don't have any gold or silver. They only have banknotes. So they stop buying land, and the value of land now starts to drop very rapidly. And a lot of these speculators will, of course, they're going to lose everything. They mortgage their farm for this loan to purchase some land, of course, the bank notes that the bank gave them are worthless now because the bank has no gold, so they can't even redeem all these banknotes. They can't pay the bank back the money they owe. Their farm has been mortgaged. People will lose a lot here, and most of the people who are losing things are not the wealthy elites. They're the people at the bottom who got in on this land deal in hopes of making a fortune, but they're going to lose what little they had already. The wealthy elites, they can take a hit. And this is what happens in most recessions. These panics that happen every few years or so. During these recessions, we will see the wealthy elites can take this hit. They've got a lot of money. They can afford to lose a little bit. But a lot of the people are going to, when they lose a little bit, they're going to lose everything. That's all they had. So they're never going to recover. The wealthy elites, they'll recover. The big cotton plantations in the South, they're going to recover. But basically what happens, what causes this, when the land market collapses, people start losing their money. All at the same time, to make matters worse, there's a sudden drop in cotton prices. And this happens in a similar way that happened back in 1819. The big consumers of cotton, the big textile mills in England and of course here in the United States, their warehouses were full. So they didn't need as much cotton right now, so they stopped buying cotton. Even if it's just for a little while, the sudden drop in cotton prices is going to further aggravate this whole economic crisis. And as a result, the economy tends to start spiraling downward very rapidly. And it's a chain reaction. Land prices go down, and then of course at the same time cotton prices dropped for a separate reason, but it's all happening at the same time. And when people lose a lot of money, they don't have any money to spend now, so they're not buying things like they used to buy. And that hurts businesses, even that don't deal with land or cotton. It hurts those local businesses because they're not taking in as much money because people aren't buying anything. So when a collapse like this happens in a major market, it sets off a chain reaction that affects every part of the economy. And this economy is going to be in recession for about 10 years, well into the 1840s, before the economy really starts to recover here. So what kind of started this whole process was the elimination of the Bank of the United States. It created an instability in the economy, which led to a lot of reckless spending and borrowing, and then of course the specie circular aggravated the situation because now it cut off the supply of gold or silver in the economy, and then of course this leads to chain reaction. Now the drop in cotton prices was not connected to the destruction of the bank or the specie circular. This is just something that happened, just one of the regular market fluctuations. And while this normally would have been able to, the economy would have been able to absorb this, with all these other problems going on at the same time, the drop in cotton prices just really pushes everything over the edge. So we're in an economic recession now. It's going to last for the next about 10 years or so. All started with this panic of 1837. This is kind of what, again, they call it a panic because when the economy starts to turn downward like this, people get nervous and they go to the bank to draw out their money. Okay, I've got money saved in the bank. I better draw out some of that money so I'll have some money to see me through these lean months of this economic recession. Of course, when they get there, the bank has no money because they had loaned out more money than they had in their vault, and basically there isn't anything. So a lot of people, even those that are not connected with this land speculation, even regular people will lose their money, and that's just kind of the unfortunate side effect of these type of situations is that without some sort of stabilizing force in the economy tends to fluctuate wildly in either direction: rapid expansion and then sudden collapse. The Bank of the United States helped to prevent or reduce that fluctuation. The economy will still fluctuate, but not to the extreme ends as it does without the bank. So getting rid of the Bank of the United States turns out to be not such a good idea for the economy. This economic crisis that ensued as a result of this, this whole bank ordeal and the specie circular, this economic crisis is going to serve as kind of a catalyst to help build opposition to Andrew Jackson. A lot of people look at Andrew Jackson as the cause of all this, and while Jackson did not cause the drop in the cotton prices, his destruction of the bank and, of course, the specie circular, these two things were both efforts of Andrew Jackson, and they did play major roles in this economic recession. Well, for this reason, a lot of people who are already kind of opposed to Andrew Jackson anyway, they're going to start consolidating this opposition. Our Democratic Republicans, and this is the party of Andrew Jackson, they're now calling themselves just Democrats. And the National Republicans are still pretty much the same at this point. So these Democrats, or these Democratic Republicans, the party of Andrew Jackson, they advocate limited government. Small, weak federal government, more power in the hands of the states, and they tend to espouse the ideals of the small farmers and the laborers, the common people. And Jackson himself has really vocalized this image of himself as a man of the people. On numerous occasions, he's openly criticized the wealthy elites of the eastern cities, and the big businesses and the bankers and so forth. He's always criticized these groups of people, and he's advertised himself as a man of the people. He supports the small farmers, the laborers, the frontier people, Southerners. Now, while he advertises his support for these groups of people, most of what he does has actually worked against them. While Jackson harshly criticizes the fact that these wealthy elites, the bankers, the big businesses, and so forth, Jackson and the Democrats, they espouse an economic policy of no economic policy. The government should stay out of the economy altogether. This limited government power, one of the things that he's talking about is the government not getting involved with the economy. Laissez-faire economics is what they call it. Laissez-faire capitalism. No government influence or regulation in the economy. So while he's saying that he supports the small common people, his limited involvement or limited regulation with the economy tends to allow the wealthy elites to do what they want to at the expense of the small farmers. So Jackson's words and his actions don't quite pair up here. So basically we've got kind of an inconsistency in what's going on with the Democrats here, with Jackson especially. So another things that the Democrats tend to espouse here is, and this is a good thing, absolute political freedom for all adult white males. Now, while ethnic minorities and women are still excluded completely from politics at this time, the fact that the Democrats espouse this universal white male suffrage, not tied to any land ownership or tax payments or anything. If you are an adult white male, then you have the right to vote, no restrictions. This represents a move toward a more democratic society. Now, while women and ethnic minorities are still on the distant horizon in terms of receiving any kind of right to vote, the fact that we are, as a society, we are moving in that direction by allowing everyone or all adult males, white males, to vote, it's a sign that America is slowly becoming more democratic. The government is starting to be more of a reflection of the people instead of just the single group of people, the wealthy landowners. So while expanded democracy is a good thing, the fact that he's limited the power of the government, specifically with regard to the economy, means that the wealthy elites, the people that he's criticized all along, now have pretty much a free hand to do whatever they want to. And this will come to the detriment of a lot of these small farmers and laborers that he supposedly supports. So the National Republicans are of course opposed to a lot of the things that these Democrats tend to espouse, especially Andrew Jackson. Most of the National Republicans, they tend to support the internal improvements, strong federal government, strong economy, big business, those sort of things. Well, these National Republicans are going to be joined by a lot of other groups of people who have come to see Andrew Jackson as a threat. The Whig Party, which will form in 1834, forms as an opposition party to Andrew Jackson. It's the only thing that these groups have in common. There'll be quite a few different groups of people joining this Whig Party, but the only thing they really have in common is their opposition to Andrew Jackson. In fact, many of these Jackson opponents tend to view him as the worst abuser of federal power. Jackson, while he's been a long-time critic of the federal government's abuse of power, Jackson himself will abuse this power in ways that no other president before him had done, to the point where a lot of his critics start referring to him as King Andrew, as kind of a criticism. And here, of course, we're looking at an illustration that was in an anti-Jackson newspaper, and this article that accompanied this image was clearly accusing Andrew Jackson of abusing his power as president, doing the very thing that he had criticized all of his opponents for doing. They called him King Andrew, and this is one of the reasons why they call themselves the Whigs. If you remember back in the early part of the semester, we talked about Charles I, Charles II, and James II, these British monarchs who had they were advocates of the absolute monarchy. They believed in this divine right of kings, and they ruled had very authoritarian style rules. They didn't want to share power with anybody. They tended to be in absolute control of the country. Well, the British politicians in Parliament that opposed these absolute monarchs, they were called Whigs. So this Whig party that forms in opposition to Andrew Jackson, they call themselves Whigs, because of that. They're kind of connecting themselves to this old British political party that opposed these absolute monarchs. So they call Andrew Jackson a king, and of course you can see in this illustration there's a lot of the things that people criticize him with. He's standing on a torn up piece of paper down here. One of these pieces of paper is the Constitution, the other is the charter for the bank. And they're referring here to his disregard of the Supreme Court, his disregard for federal law, and how he tends to rule arbitrarily. Jackson himself said that he will decide what is constitutional and what isn't. He doesn't need the Supreme Court to tell him that. And we see here this scroll in his hand labeled veto. Again, a criticism of how Jackson used his power of veto to spite his political opponents in a way that was kind of an abuse of his power. So basically all this imagery here is intended to paint Andrew Jackson as an abuser of his federal power as president, to the point where he's acting like a king. So this group of Whigs, these people who are opposed to Andrew Jackson, they're made up of several different groups of people. First and foremost are the National Republicans, and again, this is just the opposition party that already existed in opposition to the Democratic Republicans, or the Democrats, this party of Andrew Jackson. So the National Republicans make up the bulk of these Whigs. But some other people are going to join too. Radical states' rights Southerners. If you remember back during the nullification crisis, places like South Carolina, strong, staunch supporters of states' rights as opposed to strong federal government. A lot of these people, the states' rights Southerners, were kind of disgruntled with Andrew Jackson's handling of that nullification crisis. They tended to view Jackson as a betrayer of the states' rights cause. So a lot of these people will defect to this new group called the Whigs. a lot of the people who join the Whigs are Northerners who are opposed to slavery. You remember we talked about this burgeoning abolitionist movement. We're going to talk more about that next week. But a lot of these abolitionists will join this Whig party because they are opposed to Andrew Jackson because they see him as a supporter of slavery. So this Whig party will attract a lot of different groups of people. States' rights Southerners and Northern abolitionists don't have anything in common other than their opposition to Andrew Jackson. But, the Whig party will suffer because of this. Because they have so many different groups of people making up this party, they don't have a real coherent agenda as far as a platform. So in the early days of this Whig party, they're not very organized. They don't really have any clear focus, any kind of direction, other than the fact that they all hate Andrew Jackson. They don't really have anything in common. So the National Republicans, these radical states' rights Southerners, some Northern abolitionists, and of course the traditional people who supported the Federalists or the National Republicans, merchants, bankers, businessmen, professionals, this agenda of internal improvements, tariffs, banking, and business, and all those sort of things. Those were always part of the old Federalist agenda, which was adopted by the National Republicans. Other than that, there's not really a clear agenda for this party, this new Whig party. And other than their opposition to Andrew Jackson, there's not really anything that unites this group of people. And for this reason, they'll be very disorganized and not very coherent. The Whig party will last until the take a look at our flow chart here. Well, first of all, let's take a look at this illustration. This illustration appeared in another newspaper, not really criticizing Andrew Jackson, but not really sympathetic to him either. This is kind of a neutral representation here. What this editor is doing here, he's using this mythical figure or character of the Hydra. And for those of you not familiar with ancient Greek mythology, the Hydra, this mythical monster who can't really be destroyed because every time you cut off one of its heads, two more heads appear in its place. So the harder you fight this creature, the more powerful it becomes. And so this newspaper is showing Andrew Jackson basically here having made multiple enemies through the course of his presidency. His 2 terms in office, his style of leadership, his policies, his agenda has alienated a lot of his supporters. It's made enemies out of a lot of people who who were more moderates. So Jackson, in his style of leadership here, of course, he's wielding his hickory cane labeled veto. He's made so many enemies in his presidency that he can't fight them all now. And Jackson is, in a way, it looks kind of sad because he's now, he's fighting against enemies in every direction. But this is really his own doing. He's done this to himself. Jackson, at the end of his presidency, he feels embattled and he feels like everyone is against him, and it's pretty much true. Everyone is against him by the end of his presidency, but it's because of his own actions that has created this. He created this monster that he can no longer defeat. So let's talk now, finish up about the Whigs here. So this Whig party that emerges in 1834 as an opposition party to Andrew Jackson is the only thing that unites this party. One of the reasons why they will not be successful in their early years. Now they'll last for about 20 years as a political party, and eventually they will become effective as a party, and they'll win some elections. But initially, they're not very effective as a party because they don't really have any unified sense of purpose. The only thing that unites the Whigs is the fact that they are opposed to Andrew Jackson, who is the leader of the Democratic Party. So this is why the Whigs are not going to last, or not going to be very effective initially. Once Andrew Jackson is no longer president, this is in 1836, Jackson's last year in office. He will not seek a 3rd term. Keep in mind there are no term limits for presidents at this time, but Jackson will only serve 2 terms. He will not bother seeking a 3rd term. It's just kind of become a tradition at this point. Plus, Jackson's not stupid. He sees the writing on the wall. There's so much opposition to him at this point. he knows that he probably will not be able to get reelected even if he did run in 1836. So Jackson will not seek a third term. The Whig Party will try to run a candidate in the 36 election, but they're not going to get any votes because, again, they're just so disorganized and ineffective. They will be successful later on, however, but for now, at least, they are not very effective. That's all we really have for Andrew Jackson, and that kind of finishes up his presidency. One final note on Andrew Jackson. Jackson is kind of a controversial figure in U.S. history. It's kind of a love-hate sort of thing. Some people either they really love Andrew Jackson or they really hate him, and it just depends on what group of people you fell into during this time period. If you were a northern businessman, you probably hated Andrew Jackson. If you were a frontier farmer, then you probably loved him. But what's ironic about Andrew Jackson is that a lot of the things that he claimed as far as his opposition to wealthy elites and Eastern privilege and his support for frontier farmers, the reality of his presidency is that a lot of his actions kind of betrayed his claims. Jackson hated Eastern elites, but he didn't do anything to regulate their activities. The wealthy elites, the big businesses, the big banks, the private banks, and so forth, they tended to benefit from Andrew Jackson's presidency because they were free to do whatever. With no regulations in the economy, especially the presence of the Bank of the United States gone, a lot of local banks were able to do whatever they want to, and this ended up damaging the economy, especially for those at the bottom. The poor frontier people, the common man, tended to be the biggest victim of this type of policy. So it kind of backfired on him in terms of how it benefited some at the expense of others. Jackson didn't do anything to rein in the big businesses that he criticized. With this adoption of laissez-faire capitalism, basically a hands-off approach to the economy with no regulations, big business tends to run wild and do whatever they want to, and this often, very, very often, comes at the expense of the people at the bottom. So Jackson is controversial for this reason. And of course, many of the other lightning rod issues that came up during Jackson's presidency will make him a controversial figure. But despite all this controversy, Jackson represents a nation that is becoming more democratic. The fact that a person like Andrew Jackson could be elected is evidence that the nation is becoming more democratic. More people are voting. More of the lower classes of society are voting and participating in politics. And this is the reason why someone like Andrew Jackson can have a much wider appeal than any of the previous presidents before him. So while Jackson did not really contribute much to the benefit of the common man, his presidency serves as kind of a symbol of how America in general is becoming more democratic. Jackson's policies will be controversial for many years. It's just one of those things where a lot of what went on during his presidency tended to be these big controversial issues, and how he responded to them tended to draw a lot of attention. Again, Jackson is just a very different person than anyone we've seen before, and this is one of the reasons that contributes to his controversy. So there's no more new material for the second exam. Second exam will cover everything from the Constitutional Convention up through the end of Andrew Jackson's presidency. So when we come back in our next session, we'll start new material, some of the reform movements that take place as a result of this Industrial Revolution and the early 1800s. So we'll be talking about the same time period, but a different aspect of what's going on during that period.